If you enjoy my work, please subscribe and like. Also, check out my Patreon for early access, patron bonuses, and stay sparkly. Foul is Fair, Chapter 35, Charge for the Sword. It wasn't long before Kasha and Justin hit resistance. The unseelie had a knack for chaotic charges, but there was a lot of ground to cover, and by appearances, the Queen had been prepared for just this. As soon as they hit covered ground, bands of soldiers appeared to engage them, or to trap one or two stragglers and fall back into the woods. Sometimes the sheer numbers and enthusiasm fought them off. Sometimes they thinned the pack a small amount with success, and sometimes members of Kasha's troop gave chase, lowering her numbers once more. It wasn't long before the woods rang with the sounds of battle. Justin shouted a warning and raised his new shield, wincing only slightly. Pixie arrows mostly bounced off the metal, with a few sticking into it, hitting with more force than he'd have imagined possible for such tiny projectiles. Kasha growled off the words of a protective enchantment, not against the arrows themselves, those stuck neatly into her flesh in a few places, along with a number striking the cats. Her invigoration spell fought off the sleeping spells on the arrows, letting her and the cats keep moving through the hail of projectiles, all of the trio looking angrier than before the spell was cast. Others in their force were less fortunate, with unseelie falling around them. Some resisted as Kasha did, or dodged to cover, or had their own means of protection, but the numbers fell further still. By the time a host of the moth-winged sprites engaged Orla's pixies in a fierce aerial battle, Kasha had less than half of the people she had started with. Most of those remaining still made for a dangerous and enthusiastic band with no signs of pausing. It was all Justin could do to keep up with the crowd, doing his best to keep his shield at the ready and trusting in his armor's effectiveness against the tiny arrows as he raced along behind Kasha. He wasn't precisely sure of their directions, but thought the wood around them was starting to look familiar. His suspicions were confirmed when she knights emerged from cover at the edge of the clearing, forming up in ranks. More pixies and sprites emerged from the trees all around, aiming their bows at the oncoming mad rush. Kasha leaned forward, cutting the tethers binding the leopards to their chariot so they could maneuver and fight freely, while she just ducked down and rode out the wild ride, leaping out to engage a knight in close combat at the last second. Her chariot crashed into the assembled ranks on its own, and the leopards took up protective positions at their mistress's flanks. The mob just behind her slammed into the ranks on the ground, while those suited to flight or climbing took to the trees to engage the archers. Justin thought he saw a weak point in the defensive lines and rushed for it, leading with the shield and battering a knight to the ground. As he did, he could see the sword in the stone in the middle of the clearing, an honor guard, more decorated than most of the knights, standing around to watch. Before he could break free and rush them, the ranks closed, and he was forced backwards, only barely avoiding injury by a spear. The fairies around him were nearly invulnerable, at least in the sense that they'd heal almost anything that wasn't made by cold iron, which no one here seemed to be using. But Justin had no such assurance. He retreated backwards as his assailants were engaged by some sort of troll swinging a small, tree-like club. He had to dive out of the way of the swinging tree himself, reminded that his allies had, possibly, even less regard for him in some cases than his enemies at the moment. He made his way back to Kasha and the leopards. The cats let him into their defensive circle, and the satyr, despite her wild, powerful fighting style and obvious rage, shifted to allow him to fight alongside her. Even with all of his training, he had to admit that it was fortunate. Most of the Shee clearly had many decades, if not centuries, of training behind them, fighting almost purely defensively, and with the savage satyr and the leopards forcing opponents to be cautious, he was able to manage to protect himself, but unable to advance. Kasha seemed to be having better luck, even hit with several more pixie arrows and engaged by multiple Shee knights. She managed to slowly force her opponents back. Justin shifted after her, making slow progress, but progress towards the goal nonetheless. While some of the unseelie horde were being pushed back, Others, such as the troll who had provided him cover, were making similar steps forward, pushing the shee back bit by bit. It was only once they'd broken past the tree line, forcing the knights fully into the clearing, that the situation became much worse. More shee emerged from the trees. Some of them were further knights, but these, instead of joining the ranks, protected individuals who were in lighter garb and chanting. Justin stepped back on seeing them, taking cover behind a tree. A blast of fire slammed into the chest of the troll, sending it flying back with a shockwave that followed. Bursts of light flashed all over the battlefield, emitting from behind the lines of the knights so only the attackers would be blinded. Justin hid his eyes only just in time. Numerous of the unseelie weren't as fortunate. More fireballs launched into the unseelie ranks, taking their own toll. Even when they missed their mark, the shockwaves that followed scattered the ranks of the unseelie, forcing more of them to either retreat back into the woods or remain close to the ranks of the knights, which presented its own dangers. Some of the unseelie attempted to counter with their own enchantments. Greenish fireballs fired back, briar vines started to grow at the edge of the wood, and wisps of darkness started to creep onto the field, all heading for the knights. As soon as any of the enchantments reached the field, they weakened or disappeared entirely. The fireballs fizzled or dwindled to small missiles which only left small scorch marks on the armor. The briars wilted to something shee swords easily sliced through, and the darkness dissipated at the next flash of light. With the time they'd had to prepare, the queen had clearly added plenty of protective enchantments to the clearing. She might not be able to do much to the sword itself, but the ground between the woods and the blade was another matter entirely. He realized at the same time, if they'd had time to put up the defenses, who knew what else they'd prepared. "Kasha, we need to fall back!" he shouted over the din of battle. Whirling, slashing, and kicking, Kasha, Maxwell at her side, showed no signs of being willing to give up an inch of the ground she'd gained. Jude took notice, moving to help protect Justin as the squire lunged back into the melee, despite the risks, knocking aside one of the shee spearmen trying to find an opening to stab at Kasha. "We need to retreat!" he shouted again. Kasha growled at him instead, and with fewer unseelie venturing beyond the edges of the woods, he noticed that the shee ranks were closing in around them, and more carefully aimed arrows were coming their way, only barely fended off by armor and Kasha's own enchantments. He turned to cover her back, fighting back to back with her, with the leopards guarding the pair, all whirling and moving and slashing at anything that came too close while their opponents tried to trap them. Justin took a spear to the side. His armor kept it from being worse than a scratch, but he could still feel the warm trickle of blood down his skin. His counterslash broke the spear before it could do more harm. He managed to fend off the first efforts to close in and take advantage of the wound. Between the pain and the fatigue of the long run and battle, he almost missed the next detail. When the knights gave up on trying to take him down, they retreated, but further back than they had been. A quick glance confirmed that the rest of the knights around them were falling back too, with a few spears trying to prevent Kasha from following them. Dropping his sword, he grabbed for the back of Kasha's armor and pulled. Not expecting the grab, he caught her off balance and was dragging her backward towards the wood when the fireball hit where they had just been standing. He registered heat washing over them, but without any hint of pain. The shockwave was something else entirely. He held on tight to Kasha as he, she, and both the cats were launched back into the woods. Landing heavily, he tried to pull her back further under the cover, with a few more of the unseelie closing around them defensively. Kasha sat up groggily after a few moments. "We need to retreat now," Justin repeated. "We did everything we could. We have to rely on the others now." and keep these lot busy with the chase, Kasha agreed, shaking off the cobwebs. The whistle that followed was met with an answering growl and whine. Noticing the cause for distress, Justin found the spot Jude had dragged Maxwell to. Both burned and bleeding, but the bare-headed cat far worse off and not moving. He confirmed that Max was still breathing, then lifted the leopard over his shoulders. Jude limped after him as Kasha rallied her troops, regrouping those who would listen to form up for a fighting retreat, leaving the sword behind.